All right, so hello to our attendees, welcome. Looks like we got a good number here, so I'm gonna go ahead and open up our session for today. So hello, happy Monday. If you don't know me, my name is Elon Price, and I am the student representative to the executive board of the National Society of Black Physicists. And I'm super excited to be the host and moderator for today's session. So just some housekeeping. We are going to have a Q&A portion towards the end, and I will be moderating that. So if you have questions, comments, the chat should be live, but also we have our Q&A button for you to submit those throughout the interview. So just to recap, if this is your first time in this series, today marks the last of 3 interviews that we've had to celebrate Black History Month. And so the purpose of these interviews, they're being conducted by student council members, and we're going to be saving the recordings for YouTube. And they're basically the aim is to close the generational gap between senior physicists and Gen Z. And we want to do this by celebrating our impact on society, as well as finding that common ground between our experiences and inspiring future Black physicists. So with that, I'd like to begin by giving our first introduction for our interviewer today, who is going to be student council member Carlton Smith. So Carlton Smith is a second-year grad student at Yale University, pursuing his PhD in physics as part of the Integrated Physics, Engineering, and Biology program, and as a Wu Tsai Graduate Fellow. Carlton recently graduated from, well, not so recently now, graduated from the University of Florida, where he got his bachelor's in physics and as well as mathematics. And his research interests include computational neuroscience, specifically in biophysics broadly. And in Carlton's free time, he can be seen playing a guitar or bass, learning Portuguese, reading, or going on long walks. So our interviewee, or our invited guest for today, is Dr. Larry Gladney. Dr. Gladney joined Yale as a professor of physics and the Phyllis A. Wallace Dean of Diversity and Faculty Development in January 2019. In July 2022, he also assumed the role of FAS Dean of Science. Dr. Gladney's research focuses on the intersection of experimental particle physics and cosmology, where he attempts to understand the origins of and fundamental connections between matter, energy, space, and time. He's particularly interested in future explorations of the cause for the accelerated expansion of the universe. Co-author or author of more than 600 peer-reviewed publications, he came to Yale from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Professor for Faculty Excellence in the Department of Physics and Astronomy there, and the Associate Dean for Natural Sciences in the School of Arts and Sciences. At the University of Pennsylvania, he also held a secondary appointment as Professor of Education in the Higher Education Division of Penn Graduate School of Education. So with those, I'd like to welcome our speakers for today. And Carlton, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Elon. I think one of the first things I want to do before I get to the questions we have is last year we had an event titled The Future of Physics, and Dr. Gladney was one of our participants in that. And so I just want to say or deliver our gratitude one more time for him participating in that discussion that happenstance had 3 generations of physicists. But I guess to start off, I'm curious, Dr. Gladney, if you can tell us a little bit about where you grew up and where you currently reside.
Oh, Well, I was born in Mississippi, a few miles outside of Cleveland, Mississippi. I was only there 2 months. My family moved to East St. Louis, and so I grew up basically until the age of 18 in a city that was 99% African American. And then from there, went to Northwestern University for my undergraduate degree in physics, and then moved on to Stanford for my PhD. Wound up coming to the University of Pennsylvania as a postdoc and just never leaving, making my way through the ranks there until I got a very interesting inquiry about essentially what do you want to do with the rest of your life. And so having made this grand switch from experimental particle physics into cosmology around 2003, 2004, I really was pretty set on what I wanted to do research-wise. But I realized that I had done tons of outreach and I had not actually had any contribution about what happens to people after you go through K through 8, where I'd done some work there. I'd done 7th grade through 12th grade with helping people get through science and math. And then in college, while at Penn, I worked with students in their first year. And then, of course, with majors later on, and then having graduate students and postdocs, you kind of realize that you've contributed at least a little bit to all parts of that pipeline, but not to the last piece, which is how to make it from your postdoctoral experience into faculty positions. And so Yale offered the opportunity to come here and basically just try to understand whether it's possible for a place that has built its entire existence on exclusion to actually figure out how to be more inclusive at the faculty ranks. And so I came here in 2019 and lived very close to campus, so I could walk to work each day and walk home at night, and just have been really happy with the transition.
Thank you. I guess this question will kind of relate to the last question, which is how you developed an appreciation for science and how did you choose physics specifically? And I'm actually a little curious how your upbringing in East St. Louis and Mississippi I guess, sort of shaped your interest in, science broadly and physics specifically?
Yeah, I still don't know the answers to those questions. I've always been interested in science. And so according to my uncles, I started saying I wanted to be a scientist at the age of 3. And that just never shifted. But you don't really know a lot about science when you're talking about, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old. You can see quote unquote science fiction on TV, and that tells you maybe a little bit about what scientists tend to do, but it doesn't really get at how you live your life or how you pursue day to day, what turns your curiosity into actual results or explorations. So I was really 12 years old in 7th grade before I found out about physics. And as soon as I actually understood what physics was, I understood that I had always been interested in physics, not science at all in general. I'm really not that excited about chemistry or biology. Astronomy I liked, but really physics was it because it's about everything, how everything works. Like how did it begin? How does it end? How does it work? And so I've never really felt that I wanted to do anything else other than physics. And looking back on it, I can't imagine that I would have had any different path than the one I did. So I can't really say what the motivation was. It's always been there, and it's not really been something that was due to seeing somebody else in that. I mean, your upbringing, if you're in East St. Louis at that time, there were precisely 2 high schools. One of them closed in the time I was actually in high school. And so there wasn't, I think, a lot of support in the traditional ways that one thinks about being motivated to go into a field. I didn't see people who were physicists. I didn't see people who were applying mathematics to doing pretty much anything. But there was a tradition through East St. Louis of people going on to do really fantastic things, right? And so any number of entertainers, Ike and Tina Turner, they all came through East St. Louis and St. Louis at some point before they hit the national stage. For sports, really famous athletes came through there. And the first Black person I heard of who got a PhD was in sociology, was also from East St. Louis. He grew up just a few blocks from where my father's house was. And so that really was kind of the first introduction to, as a student, that you could actually do something that involved education, get a PhD, and go off and do something really fantastic. And it didn't really matter whether you had, quote unquote, the upbringing or experience from your early childhood or not. Really, it was just, you read, you get excited, you think about imagining yourself in roles that they seem impossible because you don't really see anybody else who does that. But in the end, I had a lot of people who made inroads for me, who did things that I didn't find out about until many years later. They kind of helped inspire me and move me along. So it's really the people around you, whether they let you know that or not, who kind of make a path for you. And then, of course, once you get your PhD, you get into this role of having to do a bunch of things you've never done before. You go into a classroom and you're expected to teach. You go into, as I said, I switched from experimental particle physics to cosmology in 2003, 2004. And the first job I got was to help design this $1 billion space telescope. And I knew nothing about telescopes to speak of, certainly not how you design a mission. But I realized soon after I got that position that, yeah, this is what you come to physics for, right? Every part of your life is doing something that you haven't done before, and maybe nobody else has done or seen before. And you just sort of have to figure it out. That's really the fun part. So in the end, after 20 years in the field, I kind of discovered that, yeah, that's probably what attracted me.
I guess like the last question, this question sort of builds off of the previous one. And I guess it was if you could speak a little bit about your undergrad experience and any like challenges or like positive moments that stand out to you. And I guess also you had mentioned that one of the things that has happened when you like progress through your career is that you've like steadily found people who've like inspired you or shaped you or mentored you. And so I'm also curious if like a little bit of that happened in undergrad too.
It did, but not in ways that were immediately obvious to me. So as I said, I had this feeling from 7th grade on that I wanted to be in physics, and I really didn't even consider any other kind of career. But when I got there, I was in college as a completely 100% financial aid student. My parents couldn't afford to put any money towards my education. And part of that was to be a work-study student. And so I went through this huge list of work-study jobs and didn't find anything that looked interesting at all, because most of them are, being in a dining hall or shelving books in the library. And there was precisely one of those jobs that was advertised that was with the physics department. And I immediately thought, that's got to be me, right? That's kismet. Nobody else is going to want that job, obviously. And I went and I was the last in line. I was 13th in line. Remember very specifically thinking, wow, you have to compete for everything. And When I finally got there, there was an engineer who was in charge of developing the electronics for all of the high energy physicists who were working at Northwestern, most of them doing experiments at Fermilab. And he had a very precise way of finding who he wanted, which was to ask a series of questions. And the answer to all those questions was, no, I can't do that, right? I can't solder, I can't program a computer, I can't design circuit boards from scratch, I can't test, I haven't used an oscilloscope. Basically, is no, 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 no. And then after a bit less than a minute, he just said, I'll call you. And that was it. That was the end of the interview. And I went home and I was really dejected and thinking that I haven't even been in my first class in college, and I'm already insufficient to actually work in a physics environment. But he didn't call, of course. And after almost a week, in fact, it was exactly a week, I remember just getting really angry because I grew up with Southern sensibilities. Like St. Louis is really just like Mississippi, 300 miles north. And so you don't say things that you don't intend to actually do just to be nice to people. I didn't really accept that concept. So I put every bit of bravery I had to go back and force him to tell me that I wasn't good enough to actually be in a work-study job. And as soon as I poked my head in the door, he said, oh, it's you. I guess you're ready to get started. And I said, no, you said you'd call me. And he said, well, let me tell you something. There are things that I can teach, and there are things I can't teach. Every question I asked you, I ask everybody. And none of you can actually do any of those things because you're freshmen. You're just starting out. And so of the 10 to 20 people who come in, I ask them things that I can teach them. But for the things that I can't ask, I tell each and every one of them, I'll call you. And I never call anybody. I just hire the first person who comes back. And so my first lesson was persistence is the one thing that people can't actually teach you. It has to be something that you decide on your own. You're going to stick with it. But I still didn't quite get it. And so I decided to join the group anyway, even though I thought this guy was crazy. And he gave me a lot of how to practice soldering and how to, strip circuit boards, just really menial stuff for several days. And then the PI, the professor, came in. He was a very, very imposing person, if you know him, Jerry Rosen. He's like 6'6". He had very dark hair, a goatee. He smoked a cigar everywhere, even though it was illegal to actually do that indoors, even in those days. And he had this huge booming voice, and he just said, hey, I'm looking for fresh meat. And I was, of course, the only one there. And he says, come follow me. And I followed him down to what turns out to be the garage for the physics and engineering building at that point. And in this garage, it was filled from floor to ceiling with these huge bales of gold-plated copper wire and these 20-foot steel planks. And he said, I'm building this new experiment at Fermilab. It's going to run 2 years from now. So 18 months from now, I need you to take all of this and turn it into 24 planar drift chambers. And that's it. So he obviously understood that I had no idea what a planar drift chamber is, let alone how you take all this stuff and make one, let alone 24 of them. And he slapped me on the back and he said, some assembly required, and he left. And I was so shocked that I didn't realize at that moment that I had no idea how to get back to the lab because I'd never been to this building before. So it took me about 20 minutes to actually wander my way through the halls. And as soon as I got back, there was a student actually who was, he was a master's degree student, actually not in the PhD program. And he immediately took one look at my face, knew what happened. And he gave me my first, or I guess it's really my second important lesson in physics, which was nobody knows how to do that. right? I mean, people think they know, but you know, look at a book and read. There's no book that you can sit down and read that tells you how to do it. So you just start with asking people until you find somebody who tells you how to begin. And then once you begin, you find somebody and you ask questions until you find somebody who tells you how to do the next step and the next one and the next one. And you never tick off the people in the machine shop because they actually have to do the work that you tell them to do. But other than that, you just got to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. And then it kind of dawned on me that, all right, this is why they're looking for persistence. Only somebody who's crazy enough to keep coming back day after day, thinking that they're eventually going to get this job done, is actually going to have any chance of succeeding and getting it done. And I did it, right? And so over the next year and a half, I actually built the drift chambers, and I mean, I built all of them. You not only machine them, you put them together, you drill all the holes, you put in the screws, you make all the circuit boards. I didn't do the design, but I actually made circuit boards by hand. I dipped my hands in benzene to clean off all the gunk. I filled all the boards, I soldered them in, I tested them. I made the power supplies, I made the cables, put it all together. And then at the end, my reward was to actually put it all in a truck, drive myself out to Fermi Lab, and helped install it with the graduate students on this big detector. So as far as being introduced to physics, I mean, it's a pretty brutal way to do it, but in fact, for me, it was perfect because it really sort of exemplified, as I said, you know, why do you do physics? Well, because nobody else can, right? Or at least few people ever get the opportunity, and few people, when they get the opportunity, can imagine that they're up to the challenge. But really, everybody around was exactly like that, right? There wasn't anything that you get asked to do that you figure, all right, well, I don't know how to do that, so I don't really know how to begin. You just sort of ask people, and you come out of your shell and figure out what's necessary, and then each step leads to the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that. So you can look and sort of see your future, and you can actually imagine, I can't figure out how to get there, but I understand that, you know, one way or another, I'll figure out how to make it through. And that kind of persistence is something that's sort of kept me in good stead in physics all the way through, you know, graduate school, certainly. And then like postdoc was relatively straightforward. But after that, as an assistant professor, you face those same kinds of challenges. You know, how are you going to teach and do research at the same time? I wanted to do outreach, and so I wasn't willing to give up on being able to teach in classrooms for students who are not college students. And you just figure out how to put it all together.
Awesome. I guess the next question is how did you choose graduate school, and what was your experience in it? But before this question, I guess I kind of want to ask if you feel like your experiences in research helped with your experiences in classes. I guess in a way, sort of like bolstering your like self-belief that you could do physics. Because I do think classes are like one of the biggest like hurdles that like in getting people to believe that they can do physics.
Yeah, you know, there are a lot of lessons to learn there, which I hope everybody who's in physics is getting those lessons in the right way. So first, you know, I was, of course, the only Black student through any of the classes I had as an undergraduate, you know, math or chemistry or physics or anything else really that was in the sciences. And occasionally, you know, you would see other students in the very large introductory classes, but you didn't really have the ability to make connections with them, or at least not very easily. And then, of course, in the upper level physics classes, there just wasn't anyone. So I got used to doing homework on my own and not having study groups. They didn't really work for me. And when I got to graduate school, it took a while before I realized that, yeah, you can't survive that way. So I had to figure out, you know, who to work with and discover that I had things to contribute to these, even though these students were all uniformly, they were just really top students. But what was really, I think, not apparent to me until later was that it didn't really matter how much of a genius you thought you were. Physics just kicks your butt. I mean, everybody finds a limit where this problem is just too hard and nobody's figured out how to do it. And no matter how smart you really actually are or how smart you think you are, you're going to find that nature in the end wins out. Like, it's just not possible to solve every problem that you come across. So that's an important lesson to learn. I mean, there's a certain amount of humility that you have to learn as a physics major that comes having been the top student in your class, and then finding that everybody's the top student in your class. But even among all the top students in classes, there are problems that can't readily be solved. The second was that there was a certain aspect of my experimental work which definitely bled into my classroom work, because there were people that were just absurdly talented in theoretical physics at the time that I decided to go to Stanford. And I didn't really have any reason for going to Stanford. I knew I was interested in fundamental physics, but truth be known, the reason I chose Stanford was because I got into a bunch of other places, MIT, and I think I was waitlisted at Princeton and WashU. I got into a bunch of, they were all dream places, and I couldn't decide among them. So I went to the one where people wrote to me and said, "We want you to come." And so in this particular case, it was Bert Richter, who was eventually going to become a Nobel laureate, who wrote a letter and said, "Hey, I hear you're interested in physics and Stanford and maybe particle physics. So if you decide to come here, you should come look me up." And that was it, really. That was the only reason I decided to go. But when I went, of course, you don't start going to the lab, you start in classes. And in those classes, there were two students that were off scale in terms of talent. So one had the highest score on the GRE, physics GRE that year in the country that he took it. And in fact, he got a better than perfect score because he actually came up with an answer that was more appropriate than the answer that was actually listed as correct for the exam. But he never got his PhD, just never finished. The second one was so good that he was taking all the same courses I was, but he was also the grader for those same courses. And so he would do the homework, he would grade our homework, and then that's the way it kind of went. He did get his PhD, but then I found out much later in life that he retired actually as a professional ballroom dancer. So he stayed in research maybe 5-10 years, decided to go to something really, really, really different. And so again, the persistence part really just kind of spoke out for me in that I was able to get opportunities that a huge number of graduate students didn't get, despite the fact that they were really good. And, on paper, I would say that they were certainly better than me at doing E&M problems. But when it came to like getting research work done, figuring out how to talk about it, figuring out how to convince other people that you had done the work to get the right answer, that part of it was really essential, and it was born out of the research part. And so I could take that into certainly each one of my classes and say that, yeah, these are really hard problems, and there are people for whom they're easy, but I know there are still harder problems, and the harder problems are the ones that make a difference, right? What you do at the end of chapter problems has nothing to say about how well you're going to do when you're trying to actually discover something fundamental about particle physics at the end of the day. So absolutely, having that early research experience really gave me a lot of confidence that I certainly otherwise would not have had.
Thank you. I guess I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and ask if you have any recollections of, or you can like recall and like any impacts of the civil rights movement during your or I guess more broadly, like broad social events that were happening around your time, I guess from like undergrad straight to like becoming a professor or dean.
Well, by undergrad, maybe not so much, but certainly, I grew up as a kid of the late 60s and early 70s, and my whole family had come up from the South, either from Mississippi or Tennessee. You stop in St. Louis, East St. Louis, or Chicago. Those were the two places, because those were big cities and they had jobs that Blacks could actually get. And so in those days, I would spend summers in Chicago and the rest of the time during the school year around St. Louis. St. Louis was a sundown town, and Chicago was kind of a hotbed for the Black Power movement. And so I remember being really concerned on the south side of Chicago because the Blackstone Rangers were around, and between the Black Panthers and the gangs that were around, you kind of had this feeling that you weren't really completely safe anywhere. Because to be frank, my mother always talked about not ever having any problem in Mississippi as long as you stayed on the farm or in the neighborhood where she grew up. It didn't matter. Whites and blacks were all poor. And as long as everybody was poor, there were no issues. But as soon as you stepped outside of that or went to a city or even just got on the highway, your life was really in danger from any chance encounter that you make. And so that got put into me pretty early. And so in the 70s, as I was growing up, I had constant lessons about work because the unions didn't allow blacks in a lot of occupations. Like you couldn't get in the union, and without a union card, you couldn't actually work in a lot of areas of construction. So you either had to work in the post office, some kind of a government job, or you had to work in factories. At that point, East St. Louis was like the third largest hog butchering facility on the planet. And so people did really menial, I won't say menial, they did really poor paying labor. And there weren't very many opportunities that you could readily see about how you were going to get around that if you didn't go to the military, or you have just this really small sliver of a chance of getting into college. And so I was in that part that was able to get into college, but I still remember that, the Black Power movement at that point didn't seem as though it was really making any progress, right? So there was obviously civil rights, and civil rights made it possible for there to be affirmative action. I'm pretty sure the reason I got into Northwestern and got a full ride scholarship was because of affirmative action, which I'm quite happy about. But it wasn't that easy to kind of see how blacks were helping other black people. If you talk about what the movement actually meant, it was pretty hard. And of course, I remember Martin Luther King being assassinated. I remember Malcolm X being assassinated. And so there just didn't seem to be a friendly face that you could put on the country in those days that actually made it possible to really think that you could really feel as though you were a part of something that wasn't going to be taken away from you. And there were constant reminders that had happened to older men in my family. That my grandfather always said, you always got to have 3 occupations because you never know when somebody's going to make it impossible for you to do 1 or 2 of them. So don't study just one thing, right? Don't be just physics, just put yourself out there in any number of things. And I didn't take the advice, but I certainly remember the advice and the reason, of course, from his own life that he found that was really necessary.
Thank you. So we're running a little close to the Q&A session. So I think I have really two more questions.
Mhm.
One is what's been your experience working as a professor slash dean at a predominantly white institution, and what would you say your biggest impact has been in those roles? And then the second is what are you most excited uh, for the future of physics, either research wise or like workplace wise?
Mhm. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. In terms of being a professor and an administrator, that has been terrific. I haven't actually had any real problems that I can, remember about my identity in being in those roles. To the extent that I have not really thought about the fact that I'm probably the first person to do both those roles at Penn. And, at Yale, I wasn't the first to do those roles, but in reality, we didn't have an FAS, a Faculty of Arts and Sciences, before 2014. So everybody coming into those roles, no matter what they were, was the first person to do that role because it didn't exist before. So it's been, to me, just really, blessed, right? I'm not religious, but that's really the only way to describe it. To get a chance to help other people carry out their research, their teaching, and their service has been just tremendously gratifying. And as far as, what makes it interesting is the fact that it can always be better. And one way that it can certainly be better is to be more inclusive and to have a broader set of people so that we don't even have it as a question, who's the first person to do this. As far as what I'm excited about for science and physics and astrophysics in particular, is just the technology has made it possible to just do so much more than was necessary, that was actually even possible during the time that I was a graduate student or a postdoc. So when I think about just the huge deluge of data and the fact that we have AI now to kind of help figure out, machine learning helps us figure out how to do these incredible analyses coming off these tremendous instruments. This will be the most productive time in science I think I can imagine in comparison to the past, just because it's possible to just expand your capabilities so much more. I'm teaching this course on computation now, and I just realized that the computer can write code that takes me hours to write, but it gets it wrong. And so there's still a reason to have a human being. But just the fact that it's so quick at being able to get you almost to the point where you can have something that works is just a capability that no previous generation has ever had anything that's that expansive. And so for fields like the ones I'm working in, where it takes decades to actually get from the concept to the actual data, and then you get this deluge of data, we will just be so much faster at actually getting to the point where we get that data and then being able to actually reduce it in real time. That's just fantastically exciting.
Thank you so much for answering all of our interview questions. And so I'm going to pass the baton to Elon, who's going to start hosting our Q&A section.
All righty. So thank you so much, Carlton, for the interview. Thank you, Dr. Gladney. It was really, really great to hear your perspective. I think hearing the experiences that you've gone through, and especially in this format and this detail, has really helped me connect more to your story and draw inspiration for it, for sure. And I hope the same is for the rest of our audience.
Thank you.
So for all of our attendees that are logged on today, now's the time to ask your questions. So I can wait while you type. I think you should also have the option to raise your hand, and you can be allowed to use audio if you would like to verbalize your question. but otherwise I can moderate your question for Dr. Gladney. So please, if you have any questions, submit them now. Okay, so first we have a question by our student council member, Alan Pierre-Louis, who did our first interview of the series. And he says, thanks for the talk, Dr. Gladney. What is the most probable dark matter candidate in your eyes? The axion?
Wow. Yeah, so you're going to ask me to get onto something that verges on political. I don't think we have any really terrific dark matter candidates at the moment. The axion is really popular, and just a couple of years ago, I actually headed up the effort to get a major scientific prize for the theoretical discovery of the axion. So I'm pretty excited about the prospects that we might be actually close to discovering it. And if we do, then certainly that would be a possibility. But I really think that there isn't any single candidate that, to me, comes across as really the answer. And I suspect that, and I think a lot of people are kind of moving to this viewpoint. Yeah, it's really just it's going to be a mixture of things. Like, it's not one answer. There are going to be several particles that contribute, or several fundamental fields that contribute. And somehow we're going to have to work our way through something that's too complex to really put into a very simple theoretical model and say, well, here's the evidence. It's all clean and tidy, and we can just move on to something else. I think, well, this is a question that's going to be with us for, another couple of decades.
For sure, for sure. Our next question is from Alessandra Lopez Menjivar. Sorry if I pronounce incorrectly, but wanted to give you your representation. So Alexandra is asking, how does your research look into practice? What does a day in your lab look like?
So we have to get used to not having labs in the very traditional sense anymore. Almost everything's done on the computer. So there are a lot of meetings. Basically, we do analyses. Almost everything is done with some form of machine learning these days, or neural networks. But basically, you're looking at plots and you're having discussions with people around whether people have done the plots correctly or whether or not there's other things that sort of need to be tried. I find that at this stage, I spend much more of my time actually not looking at plots, but actually trying to figure out how we support people who do the work, that actually are doing the research. So I have spent the last year and now almost a year and a half working pretty intently on what's called the LSST Discovery Alliance, which is a way in which we're trying to provide an ecostructure that is able to actually bring more people into the field, particularly around particle cosmology, but can be other branches of science like data science, for example, and support them in ways that allow them to not just get their feet wet, but actually get engaged with how exciting the science is, and get to the point where, whether they're interested in the science or they're just interested in the engineering, there are plenty of very interesting problems that you're not going to find in almost any other venue until after the utility of the techniques has been found to be useful. So the World Wide Web was like that, right? And it started in particle physics. I started making web pages in 1992, 93. And then learned Java in 1995. And so there are lots of ways in which people have not found, until it's been used a lot in physics, that this is something that's really interesting and can solve all kinds of other problems that we have. So I try to work on nowadays the things that anticipate those kinds of things happening. And that means really finding ways to support people who are engaged in discovery, but not doing the kind of typical thing graduate students do, but really are interested in like finding different ways of doing those things that we normally think of doing. And so trying to support people who are finding new technology paths, finding people who are looking at new analysis pathways, and figuring out ways to not let them slip through the cracks and get supported.
Absolutely. That's very important. So our next question comes from anonymous attendee. So thank you for your inspirational story. In your opinion, what do you think is most, in all caps, most needed to help underrepresented groups matriculate successfully into physics?
The more of us we see, the more it becomes possible for people to sort of not think about the question of whether or not I can succeed in physics. It's really, you know, the imposter syndrome stays with you your whole life. I wish I could say it gets a lot better, but I think there's no point in which you don't have some interaction that makes you doubt whether or not you've got the, you know, the ability to really do the work in the way that is going to bring a lot of advancement to the field and going to make other people, you know, be in awe of you, if you want to think about it that way. But in reality, we just have a bunch of individual stories of people who succeeded. Most of those stories we don't know, and we should, right? And so if you go to any NSBP meeting, you're going to meet people who have just had these amazing journeys and have done fantastic things. And because, you know, they're not Nobel Prize winners, which is basically if you haven't got the very, very top prize, you don't necessarily know their story. And so I think about people like Sakazi and Tingwa. I think about people like Keith Baker, who was on this call earlier, right? I mean, just fantastic stories of success and starting from exactly where anybody starts, right? And so anybody who's on this can actually be successful in doing physics or taking it out and doing engineering and starting companies and doing all kinds of incredible things. But you really have to know those stories are around and be inspired by them to, because everybody gets low. There comes a point where you get challenged. And having those stories in front of you is the way that you get past those times.
All righty, so moving along, we have a question from our very own Farah Simpson. Farah was a past student representative to the board and very soon to be doctor. So Farah is asking, how did you know which to prioritize and when? Research versus teaching versus administration versus outreach throughout your career, specifically from postdoc onwards?
Oh, well, congratulations, Farah. So I don't think you ever know, and everybody has to come up with their own way to figure out how they take risks in their career. So I was told pretty early on not to do outreach, you know, to kind of keep my head down and only focus on my research. And for the time I was a postdoc, that's exactly what I did. When I got my faculty position, though, as an assistant professor, I just said, you know, I'm not going to worry about tenure, right? That's obviously a big point, but it's not up to me who determines that. So I'm going to put in work, and sometimes it's going to be successful and sometimes it's not. So I don't know that you can game it out as well as people would like to be able to do that. It typically doesn't work any better than simply saying, these are things that I'm really interested in doing. And I absolutely understand that people don't get credit for all the good things that they actually do. And so anytime that you actually see somebody who's doing great work or asks a terrific question, you really have to support them and make sure that everybody else around you hears that this person had this really great question or a really terrific answer. Because it's easy for people to get overlooked in that. So rather than worry so much about how you're going to do the balance personally, I worry more about getting things done that actually help other people. And for my research, there were an awful lot of times where it was like that. Like I'm writing code and I'm not sure that this particular code is going to make me famous for having done work. But I've been kind of lucky that people did recognize that, this was code that was based for people to do other kinds of research on top of the code that I wrote. And so I believe that I did get credit for being able to, always kind of volunteer and jump in and do the kind of grunt work that is required to get any science to actually happen. And then, yeah, you worry about whether people are perceiving that you're putting too much time into teaching or administration. And as a dean, I can't make those worries go away, right? All I can say is you try your hardest, and there's no way in which this will have a formula that makes it easier. It really comes down to being sure that if you're working as hard as you can, that's your best shot. And the fact of the matter is that administration is something that we got to appreciate more, I think, because lack of good leadership, lack of good management really causes a huge number of problems. And it actually detracts from everybody's ability to get science done or to get teaching done. I just can't imagine telling anyone that they shouldn't spend some time on administration, despite the fact that maybe they don't have tenure yet, just because it's so necessary in order to make science happen, and particularly science.
Absolutely. I would say personally, a lot of my opportunities in my educational career has come from advocates, mentors and advocates that have been in places that I couldn't go and that were advocating for me along the way. Okay, so it looks like we have a hand raised. So I would like to, Sudhir Malik, I would like to allow you to speak if you want to give a brief intro, ask your question. You should be allowed to speak now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Gladney, for sharing your inspiring story. I am a professor of physics at University of Puerto Rico, and I do my research at the Large Hadron Collider CMS experiment. So I'm taking a walk, but I couldn't miss your talk. So my question is, we are, as part of the CMS institutes that are from United States, there are 55 of them, we are doing some DEI activities, for the reasons you very well explained. My question to you is, is there anything apparently missing that you think people should do or do more? Because, personally, I've seen the attitudes like, okay, we are doing something, right? And everybody is feeling proud of that. But the thing is, it's also good to know your views. Do you see something apparently missing or something that we should be doing? That's my question.
Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for the question. So I actually wrote a paper on this for the Computing and High Energy Physics conference last year. So I can send you the paper if you want. There's a lot. But I think you're absolutely right that we depend an awful lot on programs, and we don't actually have good studies that determine which programs are actually successful or not. And so in my job here at Yale, I'm pretty clear. I was clear when I came in. I'm not the guy who's going to come in and do a bunch of workshops. I'm not the person who's going to come in and start a bunch of programs, because I don't really think that actually helps a whole lot. What we have to do is change cultures. We have to change behaviors. And I understand how hard that is, but really that begins and ends with communication. And so the one thing that I will do is I'm constantly going to be talking to faculty, and taking on administrative roles like Dean of Science was so I would have an excuse to actually talk to people even more, particularly in the science and the STEM fields, but you know, for humanities and social sciences as well. Really, we have to have the people who are making decisions make those decisions having thought through questions like, have I got as broad a pool applying as we could have gotten? Am I actually making sure that I'm looking for the right aspects of who's good at the job, who's a good fit for the job, as opposed to the, you know, the way that it normally comes to me to rate people or rank people when I'm only looking at their CVs and applications. So really, we just have to change the mindset about how people react. And I think particle physics has done this. I mean, CERN has helped a lot. Both the CMS and ATLAS collaborations have been putting more time and effort into this. And no matter how much time and effort you put in, it's not enough, right? And so I think people can take that as depressing. I don't. I just sort of consider that it's taken centuries to get to the point where we're even considering the fact that we need to have DEI. And as soon as we do, really, we get the pushback that DEI has become this mean that means division, exclusion, discrimination. And that's, of course, never what it's intended to be about. But the pushback, again, is that we're constantly communicating with everybody about what we mean by having DEI efforts. And so the more people are actually talking about it, I think that is what actually makes the difference. And so the collaboration, the big collaborations, international collaborations, are doing a great job, I think, of actually opening up discussions, having committees, having ombudspersons and so forth. And that's all good. But really, we still have to continue the conversations with each other.
Thank you. As you also mentioned, persistence is important.
Yeah, absolutely. In this especially.
Thank you so much for answering, and thanks for the opportunity to ask questions.
All righty. Thank you so much for engaging and asking your question. So at this time, we're approaching the hour, and so that is going to be it for our questions today. We had many, many more, but I hope that this was a insightful and valuable discussion for all of our viewers. And I just want to, again, extend my thanks on behalf of the Student Council as well as NSBP for you, Dr. Gladney, joining us here today. And Carlton also for holding it down, as you always do, if you don't recognize Carlton from our Innovate seminar series. And thank you to all of the viewers for, again, engaging and listening and learning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
For sure. And so with that, I'd like to close out our Black History Month interview series. Thank you for watching, and see you at the next NSBP event.